Okay, it is 6:35 and we do our very best to end on time, if not a minute or two early. So let's get started. I will very quickly introduce myself. Oh, Pat, I'm sorry, I think I just unmuted you or muted you. I'm Marty Mecklenburg. I work for the Department of Community Investment here with the City of South Bend on a team called Engagement and Economic Empowerment. And our team does a lot of engagement work around the city, working with neighborhood organizations and neighbors and neighborhood-based groups. And we're also big fans of supporting small-scale development in the city of South Bend. And for today's call, we have Pat Matthews, who, Pat, I think I will let you introduce yourself, but Pat has done a lot of development over the years, a lot of development that many of you have probably seen and driven past, and at a scale a little bit larger than some of the projects that we've recently talked about. But we're hoping that his experiences can be scaled appropriately and benefit all of us. Again, we've already talked about some groundkeeping rules. Try to keep yourself muted unless you have a question. And I'll let Pat tell us if he's willing to entertain questions during his presentation, but always feel free to introduce yourself in the chat window and put a question in the chat window. My job will be to monitor that and to make sure that if you ask a question that Pat eventually hears it and has a chance to answer it.
You have your chat window?
So with that said, I guess my only other note would be that our friend and mentor to many of us, Monty Anderson, is also on the call, and Monty will help me moderate the conversation if needed, as questions come in and we want to ask Pat about some of his experiences. So with that, Pat, I will hand it over to you. Introduce yourself, let us know who you are and what we're going to talk about tonight.
Thank you very much. So my name is Pat Matthews, and I'm a lifelong resident of South Bend. St. Joe High School grad, IUSB for college. My background is accounting, so I feel very strongly about bookkeeping. And real estate has kept sucking me back in over the years. I saw the information that Marty had sent out and felt that there was a little bit of a void in helping future investors, future developers understand kind of at a high level today how to evaluate an investment. So with that, I have my assistant JP on the keys, and he's going to run the slides for us. So next slide. So right off the bat, I'll start by sharing some of the developments that I've done over the past decade or so. This is the overlook at Notre Dame. It's on the east side of campus, 359 units. And this was primarily studios and developed for graduate restricted housing for the University of Notre Dame. Next. Irish Flats is just up the block from that on the east side of campus. It's got 97 units, 97 beds. And when we're looking at student housing, we primarily reference those products in number of beds versus number of units. Currently, I'm sitting in this building. This is one of the corners at Eddy Street Commons. This is on the southeast corner, or primarily the east corner. And this is a 4-story mixed-use building that we've developed. And on the top floor, we have 2 penthouse units that are probably some of the most expensive per square foot units in the city of South Bend. And both of those units have sold, and I'm sitting right below them and actually in the 3rd floor on that far left window that you see right there. So several of the other projects that we've done, one of them is the Echoes. This is off of Ironwood, just south of Edison, just south of Edison and Corby. This is a 26-unit pocket neighborhood. So these homes load from the rear, and then there's a common courtyard in the center. I was fortunate enough to be part of the residential development at Eddy Street Commons. We did several projects there, and Eddy Street Commons, I share has 3 components. It's got a retail commercial component, a residential for rent component, and a residential for sale component. And we were fortunate enough to be part of the residential for sale component. So when you're looking to start a project, the first thing I want you to, that I look at and would hope that you would understand is, what are we really looking for? What are we chasing in that investment? And these are some of the points that we want to identify. What are we chasing? What's the worst that can happen? We're going to be pursuing several lanes simultaneously while we're doing our due diligence. Architectural, entitlements, funding, construction, legal, financials. We'll touch on all of those, but pretty much an overview of a project from start to finish. One of the items that I guess we didn't bullet point on here would be marketing and sales too. So when I'm evaluating an investment, the first thing and really what we're chasing, or I'm chasing, is returns. I'm looking for a high return or percentage return on my dollar, and not necessarily the one that has the most dollars involved or the biggest net profit in dollars, but really what's got the highest rate of return for me to deploy my capital. And I always want to look and figure out what's the worst thing that could happen. So in one of the developments that I had, I was fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to get a article in the South Bend Tribune above the fold on a Sunday morning. And the neighbors were complaining that I was tearing down or destroying trees that they were used to in an open lot. I have a little bit of a problem with this because it's actually trees on my own property that we were tearing down. But the point I want to make here is that we're going to have to overcome some things that we didn't foresee. Bad press or neighborhood opposition is one of them. And so we just want to make sure that we can cover that. We're going to be pursuing several lanes simultaneously. Site selection, due diligence, architectural, entitlements, funding, construction, and legal. Site selection, I usually refer to it as the dirt. And do you have a site for your idea? Or was a site presented to you and you need to figure out what you want to do with that or put on that site? So I'm often presented opportunities to purchase land and have to decide if it works or what kind of development could I put on that and would that work on that site. In site selection, we want to figure out what's appropriate, and in particular, will the community accept the idea? This pocket neighborhood that we talked about, that's one of the few in the entire area. And sometimes we have to educate the public, the surrounding neighbors, even the city council on what we're interested in doing. Some of the challenges for the small investor, small development, would be some of these, I think somebody mentioned on the notes that they were looking at doing a little cottage community. And that sounds great and I'm all in favor. Do the neighbors agree with that? What kind of challenges are you going to get from the neighborhood? In addition, we have to figure out and make sure that we have availability of sewer and water, or how is that going to be handled, and what kind of zoning requirements are going to be needed, and what kind of density we can get. One of the things that determines some of the larger developments that we do is parking, because parking drives everything. So we put together a little mock investment or a mock pro forma. And the dirt that we showed earlier in the presentation, we've chosen to put a little 4-unit townhouse project on it. And I'm going to run through some of what the next steps would be in that. Here's some additional design pictures of what that would be. Very simple construction, slab on grade. So you would have to determine, again, what type of project that you would like to put on your facility or your project, your dirt, and see if that will work. We've done office. I don't do too much retail. We've done multifamily and we've done subdivisions. We've got a very large project going on up in Granger right now, about 230 lots with water and sewer for a subdivision that we've started up there called The Hills at St. Joe Farm. Due diligence is probably the most important part of your project. So you would want to go ahead and start building a Proforma. A Proforma is the sample financial statements. So you're going to do a building budget, a development budget, a income statement, and a cash flow Proforma. In addition to that, on some of the bigger projects, banks are going to require some phase 1 environmental studies. That might be necessary. And you're going to generally need to engage a civil engineer. So a civil engineer is going to be the person that's going to, or the company that's going to place the building on the lot, determine your parking requirements and what you have available for parking, might help you with a landscaping plan if that's necessary or required by the city, help you understand what utilities are available. And this would all need to be taken care of kind of before you even put your foundation in the ground. They also provide an ALTA survey. An ALTA survey is a very important document, and I've asked my civil engineer even this year, give me the definition of the ALTA survey again. So what the civil engineer is going to do is get a copy of the title work, and the title work is going to list liens, mortgages, but the title work is also going to list easements, and in particular maybe utility easements or easements from the neighbor. And once those get placed on the survey, then that will help you determine your building footprint. So generally you might be familiar with a mortgage survey, which is pretty much just a drive-by. They're going to pick out the corner stakes on your lot, and they're going to maybe give you a drawing of the building on the lot. But it's also important to understand some of the other items that might affect the property, and the ALTA survey will take care of that. The civil engineer can also take care of land splits. They can help you do prints for a subdivision in a cottage community, or on this little example that we have here for these townhomes. What kind of land or title are we going to offer the buyers when they're looking to buy? For example, are we going to do fee simple and split up the property with individual lots? So in our case of our example, we would have 4 individual lots. Or would it be more of some common areas and shared spaces? It's probably going to be a combination of both, but your civil engineer can certainly help you figure that out and understand what kind of hoops you would need to jump through in order to have the proper splits or title structure for your buyers. Architectural and site design is going to be very important too. The architect's going to help you design your concept and understand your building layout on the lot. Once they're going to kind of do that at a 20,000 or a 30,000 foot view, and then the civil engineer will really tighten that up and make sure that it works on your lot, works with your utilities, works with any easements and encroachments. Structural engineer is the one that's going to help you decide if your structure is strong enough. They'll help you decide beams, loading of the floor systems, roof design, and make sure your loads are carried down properly. So when we build a big building, like an apartment building or an office building, we have the civil engineer help us place the building on the lot, and then once the architect gets done with their work, we send it out for a structural engineer who then tells us how to build it. MEPs refer to mechanicals, electrical, and plumbing. And mechanicals are generally your plumbing, your HVAC, etc. Entitlements, I've mentioned a couple times, that's really a fancy word for zoning approvals. So sometimes we look at property, or we do a land accumulation of residential property that might be on a new busy street, or a street that's been redesigned and now carries much more traffic, and it might be more appropriate to have a commercial structure or multifamily structure on that streetscape, but currently it might still be zoned residential. So we would have to go get the entitlement or the zoning change for a multifamily development or retail or office space. Sometimes we need to go get variances. The building I'm in is maybe 5 feet taller than the previously approved or the current zoning for our neighborhood. And so we went in and asked them if we could please build the building taller, and presented an argument for that, and we were approved for that. You'll also have to deal with density. I mentioned height restrictions. Density is the number of units or the size of the building on the lot, setbacks, parking, and then you'll have to go through permitting process, which can also include sending your plans downstate if your building is large enough or it is a multifamily. I'd probably say more than 4 units might have to go down to state. You got to decide if you're going to have fire protection in the building. And you'll be dealing with community investment at South Bend, making sure your drainage is appropriate, your building department, highway department, your driveways are appropriate. All that stuff needs to be taken care of when you're looking at your an investment and a development. Funding is important in your deal. You're going to want to decide what your deal structure is going to look like. And when you're talking with investors, the deal structure is really going to be what you and your investor decide. However, it's going to be super important that you put that in writing. So I'm just going to advocate that your structure is set up in writing and everybody understands how that capital structure is going to work. The entity structure is also important. For all of our projects, we do a single purpose entity, or we create a new LLC for each development project. And that allows us to have different investors. And it also helps us with our liability once the project is completed. Once the project is completed and disbursements have been made, then we're able to kind of shed that LLC or dissolve that LLC. And hopefully with that goes some continuing liabilities. Bank selection is important. One of the things I've learned is that the banks often, well, let me back up. When I was 25 or 35 years old, I was pretty happy to just take whatever the bank would offer. And I've learned that you can certainly ask the banker for more favorable terms. So one of the things that is important to me is low origination fees, maybe 0.5% or 1/4%, and a low interest rate. How long will I be able to get an interest-only loan while I'm stabilizing the product? Stabilizing refers to once the product has been turned over and you have your certificate of occupancy. If you have 100 units, it might take you 12 or 24 months to lease up that 100 units. That's what we refer to as stabilizing. So once the property is stabilized, then perhaps we can roll to a interest and principal payment with the bank, but they might allow us to do just interest in the meantime during construction and stabilization. So we could ask for 24 or 36 months of interest only, and we could ask for very favorable rates. On some of the projects, I've asked for LIBOR, which is kind of going away, but currently LIBOR is at about 10 basis points, a basis point being 1/100th of an interest rate. So I've asked for LIBOR plus maybe 235. So that would be 2.35% plus another 0.10%. So my overall interest rate might be 2.45%. Relationships are everything. You're going to want to develop relationships with all banks. And when we go out looking for a project or to fund a project from a bank, we send information out to half a dozen or more banks to make sure that we're getting the best rate and that the banks are fighting for our business. So construction preparation, we're going to start with a concept, could be a napkin drawing, and we're going to then share that with our architect and start rocking and rolling on the project. We're going to share the land with him, get them a layout. Sometimes we're just starting with the MACOG GIS information to help us get started on a project and see if it'll work. Legal, you're going to want to get great legal representation. I know many people in this, and when they're starting a business, are going to try and do a lot of it themselves. I would highly suggest that you hire a very professional attorney that is has a specialty or a lot of experience in the particular lane that you're looking for. So I don't want somebody who just runs contracts all day to help me get my zoning, because that's not what they're familiar with. An attorney with a great reputation is going to be very helpful in getting you over the hurdles of zoning or approvals from the city. And you will pay a lot of money, but it will be worth every penny. I'm very comfortable suggesting that, or saying that I'm happy to pay a professional rate to get the job done, and they do. Legal review will also be very important on your initial purchase agreement or your letter of intent, your environmental value evaluations, your title review, helping you with deal structure through some of their experience that they've had. CC&Rs refer to covenants, codes, and restrictions. You may, if you've got a multi-unit property that you're selling on a lot, you may have to record some covenants, codes, and restrictions that will help guide the owners on what uses you can use in the property over the next 10 or 20 years or more. You might need help with a buyer's purchase agreement if you're selling units. And you should certainly understand warranty coverage that you would be required to do if you're a builder or developer. Relationships are everything. And as I mature, I understand more and more that relationships are more and more important. So I would encourage you to participate in events like this and build relationships with other professionals in the industry and people that can help you with your development process. And if all else fails, you could call Saul. Okay, so one of the most important things is this budget pro forma. And the pro forma, Latin term, means for the sake of form or as a matter of form. And in the world of accounting, it refers to a methodology by which firms calculate financial results using certain projections or presumptions. And a pro forma should include the cash flow pro forma is one of the three most important statements. I'm going to say this is the most important statement. I see that my son dialed in from St. Louis, and he helped me put this form together, so I'm going to give him a shout out. Thanks, Max. This is going to be the most important document you produce. So in this document, in the left-hand column, we have created some assumptions for this development. And we talked about acreage we're going to purchase, how much we're going to spend on the land, and how many units we're going to sell per year, what our infrastructure costs are going to be. Infrastructure meaning more around the site. So infrastructure in a subdivision would mean the streets and the roads and the water and sewer and the storm sewer that we're putting in. Infrastructure in a small development could be parking lots or other paved areas or underground site work. We're going to determine, in this case, we're going to say we're going to sell these units for $199,000. we're going to have what was that, $5,000 worth of options, and we're going to inflate these 2.5% per year, and we're going to have another $59,000 in miscellaneous startup costs, and that'll include legal and some other soft costs. Then I've created a mini pro forma, or I'm sorry, income statement on this using the information from the cash flow statement. So we show that our gross income would be $852,000. We paid $34,000 for the land. Our improvements cost $560,000. We had some additional startup costs of $59,000. Overhead $2,000, and interest carry on our project $34,000. $689 for a net income of $164,000 or 19.21%. So one of the most important things I want you to realize for your 3 or 4 statements or the schedules that you put together is everything should tell a story. From each statement should be able to tie to a different statement, and you should be able to follow through from beginning to end. This particular page is usually the last page that I put together. I would start with a construction budget, and that construction budget will include site. And then I will, so that would be for our improvements or our bricks and sticks or vertical as we refer to it. Then I'm going to build an income statement, and the income statement would include marketing and...
Pat, excuse me, would you take a couple of questions on the way before you move on?
Sure.
There's one that Allison wants to know, what is new equity? And then there's another one, can you explain the capital stack just before you move on while you're still here in this section? What is new equity and what is the capital stack?
Very good. So capital stack, I think, was in one of the previous statements. The capital stack is going to refer to what our financing is going to look like, or how we're going to fund the entire project. So capital stack being 100%. In many cases, I'll just use this simple scenario, but we're going to have 20% of equity, new equity, or equity that we're going to put into the project, and 80% of bank financing. So in that case, the capital stack would be 20% new equity and 80% bank financing. As we get into some larger projects, sometimes there's mezzanine financing. Mezzanine financing would be something that might help us with the equity portion. So let's say that we are able to get 70% bank financing. That leaves us with 30% that the bank would like to see in equity or other financing. And sometimes there's a second, or referred to as mezzanine financing, where you might get another investor that would come in and provide 25% of the stack, or in a nice easy example, 25,000 out of 100,000, and you as the investor or sponsor of the project might only put in 5%. So that would be the definition for capital stack. And yeah, new equity, I see somebody in the new equity would be the down payment. New equity would be equity into the project.
What kind of form could that equity take?
That equity could be, well, let's say, for example, you bought a vacant lot and you had to put $50,000 or $100,000 down on the vacant lot. Let's say your overall project is going to be $500,000, and you purchased a lot which you paid cash for of $100,000, and you're just sitting on that waiting to do the rest of your due diligence. You're getting your design together, etc. The bank would accept that lot as equity for 20% of the project. So I suppose it could be a letter of credit or some other collateralized investment that would be a cash equivalent. But the problem, I shouldn't say the problem with that is, but you're going to end up paying additional interest on that.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. That helps.
Yeah. And you can be very creative in that. I think that the banks have generally gotten away from a lot of sweat equity, but it's going to be between you and your bank and whatever you guys can decide to do. Whatever you can get them to agree to, you're good to go.
If I was an architect working on a deal and my fee was $20,000, could that be equity if I did my work for is sweat equity? Could that be? You think would a bank count that?
It's very possible that a bank would count that. It would have, they would have to verify that that's an appropriate fee for the amount of work that's done.
Okay.
Okay, so if you could flip back just one more time. So this particular page was too long to fit in one slide. So as we get down to the bottom, well, I'll show you that there's additional information here, but I'm going to just go over the top right now on the right-hand 2/3. So the first area that I have is just to help me with some calculations on inventory and lots sold. Then I'm going to get into the sources of cash, which is, in our example, we talked about equity and bank financing. Then we have lot sales or other income per lot for our total source of cash. And when I build a pro forma, I'm going to do cash on cash first, and then we will address leverage in a moment. In this particular case, and in these pro formas, you're going to need a 0 year to make sure that your IRR works out. IRR is internal rate of return, and we'll see that in our next slide. So moving on down this page, we've got our total sources of cash in our 0 year, our uses of cash, and then we move down to our unlevered free cash flow, and then we take our bank financing into account. So we're going to, as we sell units, we're going to have to make a curtailment, as we refer to it, or an amortization payment, a principal payment. Curtailment equals a principal payment on the bank loan. And generally, it's about 70% of the proceeds that we would get out of a sale. So if these units were selling for approximately $200,000, that curtailment would probably be in the neighborhood of $140,000 or $150,000 per unit. And banks are generally going to want to get paid off at approximately 70% of the inventory sold. So you can kind of keep those two items in mind. Both are approximately 70%. And if you had a 100 lot subdivision, the bank would want to be paid off when you sold the 70th lot. And generally then in development, majority of our cash flow profits come at the end of the development, because the bank wants to make sure that they have plenty of, what do I want to say? They just want to make sure they get paid off first. That's the key. So, and that your skin is in the game the longest. Okay, so we've got unlevered free cash flow. Then we move into the bank financing area on the spreadsheet, and we come up with a levered free cash flow. So you can see in the 2023 #1 column that our unlevered cash flow was $202,000, but after we paid off our bank and we made our interest payments, we only netted $3,000 that year or that period, and that the majority of our profits come in later, or our free cash flow profits come in later. The land and phase development facility. Facility is a bank word for loans. So if you talk to a bank or need multiple loans, they might refer to those as facilities. All right, then we're going to skip to the next slide as we move on down the sheet.
Hey, Pat.
Yes.
Do you collect development fees as you go along? So you pay, how do you pay your overhead to support your business as you go along before you get to the profits? Do you pay yourself a fee?
I started to do that in some of the projects. In the smaller ones, the bank's probably not going to go for that, or hasn't been my experience. And even in one of the projects that we're doing that's over $10 million, one of the banks said, they didn't get the deal, but they said that they wanted us to take the fee out after the bank was paid off, and they lost the deal. And that was one of the things that helped me make the decision to choose another bank was that they were putting one of those restrictions on us. So we ended up at a bank that did allow us to take a management fee during construction. So again, that's going to be something that you and your banker will have to negotiate through. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, so moving on down through this Proforma, cash flow Proforma. This beginning balance, phase funding, mandatory curtailment, that's an area that I'm doing some calculations in. And I'm using the average of the beginning balance and the ending balance to calculate my interest rate. On the left-hand side, you can see that my financing rate, this project is underwritten, or I proformed it at 6%. And we talked about the amortization, and the amortization per lot, that's the curtailment, or the bank payment, is $174,900. And in this example, my construction loan as a percent of the total development cost is 75%. So we then calculate the cash flows and the returns calculation after we calculate our cash flows. So the returns calculation is going to be based on our outflows and our inflows. And it's one of the nice things that Excel or a Google Sheets will do for you, is help you calculate this information. So the IRR is, and we'll cover this in a future slide, the IRR is the internal rate of return. And when you start to look this up on the internet, it will tell you the definitions will be like, oh, this brings everything back to zero and solves for whatever. And the bottom line is IRR solves for the interest rate. So if you have uneven cash flows and you have to have an outflow, so that's our 163, and then we have uneven inflows, the IRR formula will help you determine what your overall rate of return is with those outflows and inflows. The MOIC is the multiple of invested capital. So in this case, we're going to have a 2x. So we've invested 163,000 and we're getting 2 times back on that. That must be 3 times, right? Well, I think we've taken out the original 163. And then no, I guess not. All right, cumulative cash flow to equity, so that's not correct. So 2 times, we put in 1, we get back 2. And the cumulative cash flow to equity is 164, so I'm going to call that essentially 1 time. So we get back our initial investment plus another $164,000. On the right-hand side, I've put the NPV and the hurdle rate. NPV is net present value, and the hurdle rate is 12%. And the net present value calculates out to 79 or 79,000. There is a difference between NPV and IRR, and I think we have a slide that talks about that in another minute or two, so I won't get too caught on that. But in this case, we said, we're not interested in doing a development that would return less than 12%. That would be our hurdle rate. And we, as long as that number turns up positive, we're meeting our hurdle. We're going over the hurdle. Okay, so we talked a little bit about IRR, it's the internal rate of return, and it, I don't need to read that out loud to all you guys, but the key word here, or the key thing for me, I'm sorry.
Jesus is my Father. Jesus sits at the right hand.
Matt, I think it's an accident there. Hold on.
No problem.
All right, I think he's muted.
Okay, so the IRR, as I mentioned in the previous slide, really, in my opinion, solves for the interest rate and allows you to determine what the interest rate is with variable cash flows. The net present value is the difference between the present value of cash flows and the present value of cash flows paid over time. So the IRR and the net present value are similar but different. You can have a positive IRR but a negative net present value. So in our case, the IRR I think was 30% or so. Apologize if you guys are hearing that. I have some fire trucks driving by. And the net present value helps us determine that we are in fact making it past our hurdle rate. A couple of similar but different formulas. And the hurdle rate is the minimum rate we would want to accept on a project. And generally we want to be over that hurdle rate because stuff always goes sideways. So take a minute and review this. We could certainly develop a pro forma or get to the end of a pro forma and have an IRR that was 10% and a net present value that was a negative number. Even though our return is positive, it still might be less than what we would want for to take the risk on as an investment. So I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to answer any questions. I feel like I flew through that because there's a lot of information in there, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah, that's I think many folks on the call have seen a pro forma before. Yours was plenty complex, so it's good to see what it takes to do a bigger project. We have a small enough group here. If you want to unmute yourself and ask Pat a more detailed question, even if it's just about some of the terminology that he was using, or some of the process that he's gone through on some of his developments. I know, Pat, I'm always interested in lessons learned. You've done a lot of projects. I'm sure not all of them have gone just the way you expected. You know, you've mentioned a couple times as you've gotten older, you've learned a few things along the way. I think those lessons are always valuable for us to hear. So I don't know if you want to share a story from one of your developments that you really learned a strong lesson from that made you a better developer. I don't want to put you in the spot, but you know. Yeah.
There's a question out there.
Hey, Marty.
Hi,
this
Barbara.
is Barbara. I have a question for Pat before he gets started.
Yep.
Pat, when your very first project, when you was starting at the very beginning, tell us a little bit about how that went and what you learned in your process.
So I started in just single family residential rentals, got up to 20 or 30 units. And I'm trying to think about what my first development might have been. It was several decades ago.
Okay.
I was working with a handyman through my late teenage years. And I think that we had purchased maybe 10 or 15 acres and put in 15 or 20 lots, and they required a well and septic, and at that time wells and septic, in particular septic permits, were easier to get. But through that process we purchased a what used to be an old the land was used for a guy that cut down trees, and when we got halfway through the project and they were trying to put the roads in, we found a giant bury pit. And so we had to excavate that all out because the branches and tree stumps will deteriorate over time, and then those will create sinkholes. And so again, it never goes quite as smoothly as you think it's going to, but we were to overcome it. It's important. I would tell everybody that they need to have a very decent contingency and don't skimp on the contingency and make it like 2%. It generally needs to be 5% and maybe even 10% as you start off, so that you're not caught upside down, because nothing is worse than capital calls or unforeseen capital events that would require capital that you didn't have or you needed to scramble for.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And don't be shy, folks. Pat's a great resource series and a lot of great projects.
While everybody else thinking, I'll follow up. Pat, what did you do for funding on those first projects?
That first project, I think that we certainly came up with the resources. So I don't remember what the numbers were, but we came up with the, I'll say 20% down, could have been 25% down. And then went out and got bank financing for the balance of it. I can remember that I was younger and, you know, I was showing the information or some paperwork to the bankers and they're like, you're how old? You're going to make how much on this? I mean, they were kind of surprised that I was there in their office trying to put this project together and it was going to be successful.
Great.
Allison?
So my question, I don't know if you're the person to answer it, or maybe Marty might have some insights, but obviously there are a lot of vacant lots in South Bend because houses were demolished by the city during the vacant abandoned program. What is going to be the status of those lots when you go in to try to build on them? Are they going to be able to have a slab set on them, or are they going to need to be excavated, like you said about your first project, where there was kind of a heap of stuff to deal with under that ground? Does anyone know, like, what the status of those lots would be from those demolitions, if they were done well, or if things were just buried on site, or what that might be like?
Marty?
I was afraid.
I know that you know the answer to this.
Well, the answer is it's going to really depend. I believe that demolitions done in recent years are done in a more proper and efficient manner. I think there are some cases of older demolitions where, you know, the house was basically sort of knocked into the basement effectively. You can even see evidence of that on some of the older lots where you do see some sinkholes or, you know, a massive depression where the house probably used to be on the lot. I think, Pat, you would probably advise, I mean, that's where you would have to, I mean, obviously before you do any development, you need to get somebody out there to take a look at that to make sure you're not going to open up a can of worms.
Correct. So it's my understanding that kind of no rhyme or reason, but certainly a large number, I don't necessarily want to say majority, but a large number of homes that were demolished, they may have scraped the top off and then collapsed the foundation into the hole and backfilled it. That will be problematic for future home builders. And if you're buying or getting a lot from the city, it would be my suggestion that you absolutely have those conversations and are able to determine if there's going to be extra work done on those. So I am a past president of the St. Joseph County Home Builders Association, and I have great relationships with other home builders in the area. And this situation or conversation comes up often, and it could be $15,000 or $20,000 additional work for some of those lots. In addition to that, I would like to warn you or make you aware that you could buy the same, be on the same block and buy a house or a lot on the other side of the street, and it could cost you an additional $15,000 just because of the cost of hooking up to the sewer. So it's my understanding that currently the city is working on a program, not rolled out yet, that would essentially say you're going to max out at $8,000 or $10,000 to hook up your sewer, and that they would cover any additional expense. So the city is also aware that you could be in an area that the sewer is old and deep and across the street, and simply by choosing a lot on one side of the street or the other, your cost of construction could vary immensely.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think any of us who own a vacant lot, we know that you can't just, you can never make the assumption that your water and sewer line, in fact, it's very unlikely that your water and sewer line are going to be workable on that empty lot. And it's very expensive to fix the problem because you've got to excavate, you got to close the street, you got to excavate all the way down to that sewer and water connection in the street. And as Pat says, it could be even on the other side of the street, depending on your circumstances. And Pat, you are also correct that there's been a lot of talk at the city about figuring out some kind of a program to help developers with small lots mitigate some of that cost by capping it or providing a one-time grant of some sort to help cover those costs. Because right away, you own an empty lot. In some cases, you're already sort of $10,000 in the hole because before you even start development, that connection has to be part of the process.
Can I follow up on that question? So the city certainly has street repairs and water and sewer repairs. From my understanding, for instance, Portage is shut down again and people are on a boil water order. So it might make sense for the city to really be open about when it's doing a street rebuild that includes the infrastructure, because that would be an ideal time to start putting a building along there where there's a vacant lot, because then they could really cheaply put in that infrastructure as they're replacing the other lead lines for the sewer and water. Is there any plan, and this would maybe be for Marty again, to integrate basically capital and redevelopment plans between community investment and the Public Works Department to make for an easier development process that's also not going to require ripping up streets that were maybe just redone or spending a lot of money?
I mean, I understand the question and it makes sense the way you're describing it. I think for the most part, when the city is redoing streets, we're just repaving streets. We're resurfacing them. So we're scraping up a few inches of asphalt and we're laying down a brand new layer of asphalt on them. To make the water and sewer connection, that requires excavation down sometimes 10, 12, 15 feet down below the street. So there aren't a lot of cases where the city is doing that level of street work as a repair job, unfortunately. Because if you were, yeah, it would make sense.
Should be doing that.
Well, I mean, that's a broader question then.
Failing.
Yeah. That's definitely a broader question. It's but in a typical resurfacing job, it's not clear that there wouldn't be a huge advantage to doing the excavation work at that same time. There would be a little advantage though, for sure. It would be nice if the city would be able to go through and rebuild all the water and sewer lines and make them available on empty lots. But it's always a cost balance.
I guess my thought would be that if you mapped where the water and sewer lines are, getting to be over 100 years old, and figure out when that street will actually need to be rebuilt, because I'm guessing we have quite a few of those that will need totally rebuilt down to, the sand and underlayment, I guess, whatever it would be called, that would be helpful for kind of reducing how much extra money the city's spending on subsidies and kind of be a better comprehensive use of funds.
You got some thoughts on that, Monty?
Yeah, I just got to reiterate a couple of things Pat said. When you're most of these small builders and small developers don't go get soil tests, don't drill, and they don't get a civil engineer to help. They'll just assume that things are there, and you know what assume means, right? And so, I mean, I think it's money worth spending to test the soil, even on every single family lot. And then also that you would have a civil engineer right up front to tell you, as you're doing your due diligence, that, yeah, I can hook up to the sewer there. It's not too small. There's many times there's sewer that may be running across the property that you can't hook up to because it's either too big or too small. And so that you get an expert to tell you these kinds of things and work with you to make sure your drainage is good, your sewer is good, all that, if you don't get the underground stuff right, you have a foundation problem, or you have a sewer, it's just going to be problem after problem if you don't start right. And so I think hiring the right professionals from the beginning is really key, and hiring a professional that can work at the scale you're working at too. You got to make sure you don't go out and hire somebody that's doing hospitals all over the country. You want to hire somebody that does this kind of work. But that's really key. And Pat, I appreciate Pat saying that up front here. That's really important. And I think we miss that too many times, small builders and developers.
I just want to say, piggybacking on Monty, over in the NNN where we've been doing our work on what we call Shedley Triangle, Habitat put up 5 houses on vacant lots there. It cost them about $8,000 to $12,000 for each one of those. we had a lot we were going to build a tiny house on, and it was 17,000, so we backed off on it. We got another couple of lots we built one on, and we were able to put them together. And still had to put an extra $11,000 into each project to put it up, and so that made those slim projects. So getting ahead of that makes a lot of sense. Put in your pro forma. I think the biggest issue is just what Pat said. This whole idea of just, number one, have a contingency, but number two, do your due diligence so that, okay, we paid $13,000 for those two tiny artist houses you've seen us put up on Portage. Well, we had that figured out. We knew that one was coming up, so we could sort of figure it into the deal. But if you don't have it figured into the deal, then, on these places, in some of these neighborhoods, that, as Marnie said, could be your margin.
It's been my experience that the site work is probably the biggest unknown, even when you're getting started. And that's the one that's the most difficult to control. Certainly you can have some surprises and expenses as you're going vertical, but once you get your site work done and you're out of the ground, it's much easier to control your construction costs.
Yeah, good question. Does each, I see I'm looking here in the chat window, Brian is asking, does each empty lot have the date of demo on record? I believe unless it happened a long time ago, the answer would be yes to that, but I will double check that, Brian. Obviously South Bend, one of our challenges as an older city is we have a lot of older infrastructure. And, if a building was torn down in the 60s, we may or may not have appropriate records for what happened on that site. But I'll check and see what the dates on those things are, Brian, because that's a good question.
And I don't know what the date would be that helpful. Really, the information is, the vendor that did it, and does he have a reputation for burying the foundation or not? And some of the guys that did the demo work over the last decade or 15 years are no longer around. So you're just gonna have to do some geotechnical work to figure that out.
All right.
Any other questions I can help anybody with?
More questions here. Monty, do you have any more questions for Pat? You're speaking a lot of the same language.
No, I think it was nice to hear Pat give such a technical presentation that shows us really all the details of what we need to do. He laid it out, I think, very well. All those things, they're all important. I don't care if you're doing a 10-story building or you're doing a single family lot. All the same things are important. And
Agreed.
you take all those things seriously. I appreciate, Pat, your those techniques. There's a lot of terms you heard Pat talk about today. Maybe you don't know. You need to find out what those are. He doesn't have. I mean, he's learned this over what, 30 years, Pat, or whatever.
Yes.
So he didn't just learn this overnight. This is a lifetime of learning and practicing.
Yeah. There was a question about sharing the slide deck, and I'm happy to. I'm going to strip out some stuff out of that, but I'm happy to make sure that the guts of that gets carried over, and I'll share that with Marty, and you can distribute it.
Yep, that'd be great, Pat. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Monty too. I mean, for both of you guys, it is a little intimidating, right? There's a lot of funny words in there, and even words that mean one thing and in one context, what was the word you mentioned, but in a banking context, it means something completely different. So, we know that's hard for small developers. It's hard for me, but one of our goals is to help folks when they do have to have that conversation with the banker, or they are interviewing bankers as part of a deal that they're trying to put together, that we can speak that language, right? And we know when the banker says X, Y, or Z, we are ready to respond to that question or respond to that terminology. So it's tricky. It's tricky, and it's a barrier. It's a barrier for development in some ways, in some significant ways. But the more we can do to help each other and help educate each other, I think that's why this this sort of ecosystem that we've been developing and the work that we've been doing, we can lean on one another to help answer some of those questions. So Pat, now you're part of the ecosystem too, so maybe we'll lean on you for a little help from every now and again.
Yeah, Marty, I had another question for Pat. This is Barbara.
Yeah, go ahead.
Pat, you mentioned the civil engineer, the structure engineer, and the different people that you call on. Would you be willing to share a few names that's, if we have any local that maybe would be willing to advise us or have a Zoom meeting with us to give us an idea of their process?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll get those names to Marty and he can reach out to them and get that set up.
Yeah, thank you so much, because that is exactly what I'm looking to do now. I'm buying land to do some development on, and I definitely would need some of that contact information. So
great. Yes.
And if you ever available for mentoring, let Marty know. I want to be first in line.
No, that's actually, I would be very happy to do that. So if anybody has any questions outside of this, wants to email me or give me a phone call, I'm happy to visit with everybody. I am a big believer of, I operate from a perspective of abundance, and we're not taking from each other. There's so much wonderful opportunity out there that I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Great, Pat. Thank you. Pat, there's one more question in the chat window about the management fee. So kind of going back to that question. I don't know if you can see the the window there. Is it paid to the individual, paid by the LLC, or the LLC that gets the loan?
In our particular case, the management fee is paid. Well, it's paid to the LLC or to the developer. So in this case, it's a development. We're referring to it as a development fee, and a management fee might be a little bit different. So if there's a construction manager or a profit that a general contractor would get, and when you say manager, I'm going to say construction manager, and in the messages you can tell me if that's what you're referring to. But in our case, I'm referring to a development fee, and the development fee then is sent to the LLC and distributed to the parties that are part of the development team.
So is that fee usually less than what's owed on a month-to-month basis for the loan?
Yes, or actually not really. I don't think that those two as being apples to apples. So, excuse me, a management fee, or in this case, I'm going to say construction profit. Depending on how big the project is, in our large, multi-million-dollar projects, we're trying to get the construction manager or the general contractor down in the 4, 5, 6% range. The development fee might be 2 or 3% of the entire project. And so they're kind of two different scenarios. One thing I didn't show on the Proforma, well, I showed it, I think, but generally we're going to have an interest carve out of our loan, and I feel like that's the question you're asking, is how are we going to make that monthly payment during construction and stabilization. And so in our pro forma, we're going to certainly have a line item for financial, and then deeper into that, we're going to have an interest rate carry line, and that interest rate carry is usually carved out of the loan. So let's say the loan is just an easy number, $100,000. They might carve out $6,000 or $8,000 or $10,000, whatever we determine the loan, the estimated interest is going to be over the course of the project. And they would say, we're going to loan you up to X might, or, you know, the 100%, but not the interest. And then during each month, they'll draw on the loan to make that interest payment. So if I had a $10 million loan, they might carve out $250,000 or $300,000 for interest. I would only have 9.7 available. And then each month we would have to track that $300,000 reserve, how that is being allocated and dwindled down. So then at the end of the project, 24, 36 months later, we've drawn out all $10 million, but I've only used 9.7 for development and construction, and 300,000 was paid in interest during the term of the project. Was that helpful?
Must have been.
Okay.
So I think everyone can see my screen right now. I have put up the series. We just got through February. I'll pitch just briefly here. March, we are going to have a local real estate attorney dig deeper into real estate law and some of the common pitfalls and some of the things we should be watching out for around real estate transactions. And then on April 20th, we will have Randy James, who's our building commissioner, and Angela Smith, who's our zoning guru, talk about what to watch out for in terms of building and zoning codes. Pat touched on it briefly today, and we'll have a chance to ask both of them direct questions about what to watch out for when it comes to purchasing property. And we see this happen all the time. Someone buys a piece of property with a great idea, and then they find out, oh, wait, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not allowed to put that use on that property per current zoning, for example. So it is definitely something to watch out for, building codes as well. So that'll be a great chance to ask questions. And then finally, we haven't figured it out yet, but we are going to do an in-person networking event in May once the weather gets nice, and all of you will be invited. We had a really wonderful time at Howard Park in the fall of 2021, and a great chance to visit, get to know one another, ask questions, and make introductions. We feel like that was valuable and we want to do it again. So Pat will make sure to invite you to that as well. Beyond that, the recording of this call, if you give me a couple of days, will be posted to the city's YouTube channel. So if you came late or if you want to share with a friend, it will eventually be up there along with the original 3 that we've done already. Hopefully that'll be a resource. Are there any other questions? I mean, we have a few more minutes if anybody wants to ask Pat a wrap-up question or a final question. If not, it's totally fine to leave a couple minutes early.
Pat, thank you so much for your information and for sharing with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Pat, really, thank you for volunteering to do this. Pat reached out to me and volunteered to do this, which was wonderful. You know, we need experts like Pat who are willing to share their experiences with the community, because that's, again, like the networking and to know that you're not alone in doing this work and that there are folks to learn from. It makes a big difference in making stuff happen. So thank you for volunteering, Pat. Thank you for spending your time this evening.
It's my pleasure. I hope it was helpful to everybody.
I'll look for your modified PowerPoint presentation, and I'll include that also in a follow-up email along with the link to the recording.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And Monty, thank you for being here tonight as well.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Marty. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a great night, everyone. Hey, Marty.
Oh, hey, Joseph. I didn't know that was you. I just saw Joseph. Good to see you. I'm glad you joined the call. Ask questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great presentation. Had a blast.
Good. Well, we're trying to make these useful, you know, and it's obviously kind of a la carte. Not every presentation is right for everyone, but we're trying to cover topics that are important to small developers. And, you know, here we are. Yeah.
I loved, you know, the teaching on the aspect of interest and whatnot. You know, I've definitely been diving into that quite a bit here lately, considering,
Yeah.
our situation. So thank you so much for,
Yeah.
they say a very inclusive and informative meeting.
Good. Well, I'm glad you were here, Joe. Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Shane. We'll talk to you. I need to talk to you soon, Shane.
I got you. Absolutely.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.